Hi guys, today we're going to focus on the Second Great Awakening. We've already covered the First Great Awakening, but the Second Great Awakening is arguably more important. So this is a movement in America that truly brings religion into the culture of American life in a way that really hadn't even existed before. So religion had always been important in America. We know that a lot of religious people came to America specifically to escape persecution in Europe. And even in places like Virginia, which were founded for economic reasons, there were still a lot of religious people, especially through the Anglican Church. So religion was a really vital part of American society. But what the Second Great Awakening did is it tied religion and social movements together in a way that hadn't necessarily happened before. Because as we went through the Revolutionary War, there became this growing secularism within the country, especially within American politics, that really did separate church and state. That idea of tolerance that we had talked about earlier, really taking root in our politics to the point where even within our Bill of Rights, there is no official state religion in America. There is a specific separation between church and state, and all of that led to a situation where politics and religion weren't necessarily well meshed together. Not that they weren't important, but that officially they weren't meshed. And what the Second Great Awakening does is it kind of re-interweaves religion into American society, specifically in grassroots cultural movements. So it starts in about the 1790s, and then it goes through the about 1840s. It's easiest just to remember early 1800s. When we're looking at causes, one of the major causes is a response to a drop in church attendance. Because as I already said, church and religion are very important in American society, and they had been before this as well. And so as it became noticeable that church attendance was a little bit lower because Americans had been a little bit preoccupied before the 1790s with a lot of politics, to be honest, from about 1763 to the end of the 1700s, it was very political. Like, there was that push against Britain, and then there was the war against Britain, and then the founding of the country, and all of that seemed to take center stage away from the day-to-day normal lives of people, which did tend to revolve around churches. And so as a result of that drop in church attendance, people started to essentially become nostalgic for the way that things had used to be when things were, normal and not super tension built up because of conflicts. People became inspired to worship at what were called camp meetings. So they would sort of escape their lives and go into the wilderness and get away from things that were man-made and into nature, and basically just go to camps, religious camps, where they could kind of get away for the weekend and listen to sermons and reconnect with their spirituality. And then an outcropping of this revival of the Second Great Awakening and this revival of religion was an increased attention to essentially morality within society, and it spawned a social movement, so not a religious movement, because the Second Great Awakening is a religious movement, but it spawned a social movement that we call the antebellum reform movement. One of the things that I want to focus on for this particular lesson is we're going to be practicing LEQs. And to do a proper LEQ or a proper DBQ, you usually lead with context. That's how you write your introduction. So what I want to cover is what is context and how is it different than causation. So historical context, as you can see on the screen, is understood as the events and climates that create a specific or that inform an issue at hand. So it's not necessarily the causes, it's the atmosphere that surrounds a particular event. So the example that you have is the Canadian government, much like the American government, actually cut some of their defense spending at the end of the 1990s. However, Canada did a lot more. So the idea is the cause of that is that they were running significant budgetary deficits. They couldn't afford to maintain that anymore, and they didn't feel like they had as important a military role to play. But then the question is, why? So yes, those are the causes of the decrease in their budget, but why would they feel like they could decrease their military budget? Why did they feel like there wasn't as much of a military role for Canada to play? And the context is that the Cold War had just ended. So that huge period of tension in the world was now over. So it felt like they had a choice, that they didn't have to spend all of their money on their military budget. And so they were able to start cutting that and redirecting it into other things. So the context is that the Cold War is ending, even though that's not a direct cause of them cutting their budget. So it's correlation, not causation. It happens at the same time. And for us, that's the context. So what is happening around the same time that is relevant, that kind of helps you explain why the causes happen. So when we're looking at the Second Great Awakening, church attendance being low is a cause. Like, we see that as a cause for church attendance then rising. People are noticing they want to go back to church. There's an increased desire for religiosity. There are camps that are being set up that people can go to. But when we're looking at context, we need to look at the general atmosphere surrounding religion in America. And the general atmosphere is that not everyone really does support the full separation of church and state. For instance, look at New England. The founding of New England is very religious. And so when you're talking about everyday people, there is this kind of belief that church is really important to the moral backbone of America. And being a moral person kind of even informs you being a good democratic citizen. And so there is this desire and a need in America to have religious morality as part of our society. And so what we see is that while yes, church and state are separated, and no, politics can't really control religion and vice versa, we do see churches receive benefits. So we see states that don't tax their churches, they don't tax ministers' salaries, they're considered non-taxable organizations. So we do still see state support of churches, we just don't see them controlled, and then vice versa. So we have that kind of dual attitude that churches should be supported, and that they should be supported because they create a more moral society, and it's necessary for a moral society if you're going to elect people to govern or vote or anything like that. If you're going to give people control, you need to have people who are moral. And so it's that context and that attitude that lead to the causes, or that allow for the causes to create the Second Great Awakening. In terms of what happens, we actually see regional differences. So in the North and in the West, what typically happens is that the Second Great Awakening promotes this ideology of spiritual equality, that everyone is equal in the eyes of God, something that I think really does translate into modern Christianity in America, this idea of equality in the eyes of God. And this becomes particularly appealing to groups that had been marginalized in America. So, for example, women and African Americans, especially slaves, who were not equal in the eyes of government. And so it created a situation where inclusion and equality felt real. And those are qualities, when I say that the Second Great Awakening made America a truly religious society, this is an attitude that has never gone away. It has long-lasting ramifications that we still feel today. So African Americans specifically embraced Christianity in very high rates, mostly because they identified with God being, as they called it, the liberator of the Jews, another enslaved people. And so they kind of latched on to certain text within the Bible, and it gave them a feeling of inclusion in Christianity, which spawned a lot of black churches in both the North, South, and in the West. So all of those things are kind of happening. The problem is that in the South, there was a pretty strict hierarchy of society, which we could obviously see through the inclusion of slavery. You have to have a strict hierarchy for that to work. Plus, the South existed with a much more patriarchal society hierarchy. And so because of the appeal, especially to women and to African Americans, it caused kind of a backlash in the South that especially Southern white men didn't necessarily support the movement. They saw it kind of as an attack on their way of life. And so the doctrine of spiritual equality gradually kind of faded in the South, and it became more of a message of patriarchal authority, where the father takes care of the shepherd, or the shepherd takes care of the flock. And so the shepherd in this case being the white man. And so while the Second Great Awakening and the increase in religiosity happened throughout the country, it didn't look the same everywhere. So in the North and the West, it's much more about equality. In the South, it's a little bit more about egalitarianism, where you have a role and everybody should be included, but your roles are not necessarily equal. When we're looking at the significance, one of the major ideas that gets pushed during the Second Great Awakening is called the perfectibility of man. So gone are the days of predetermination, where there's nothing you can specifically do to earn your way into heaven. This is about you becoming a better, more perfect person. So it's not being perfect, it's about becoming more perfect. You can never really reach perfection. You aren't God, but you can become a better person. You can perfect yourself. And this is also something that really does continue into modern Christianity in America. This idea that you can be a better person. You can be kinder. You can be more giving, you can be more moral, you can understand things better, you can be more empathetic. All of those things, those qualities that we consider both values and morals within Christianity, come from this concept of the perfectibility of man. And so with this, we see certain denominations starting to work together. So in the First Great Awakening, you had that conflict between the old lights and the new lights. And I'm not going to tell you that goes away completely in the Second Great Awakening. It doesn't. But you see a lot more of what are called interdenominational groups. So Lutherans working with probably not Catholics, but like Lutherans working with Anglicans, working with Unitarians, all of these different kinds of Christians working together because they share a common underlying belief in perfectibility and religiosity and this idea of giving back to your community. A lot of that cooperation between denominations was actually taken up by women. So while women couldn't necessarily be specifically church leaders like deacons or priests or ministers, they did often lead Sunday school groups and interdenominational social groups. And so those connections between churches became part of what women really focused on, and it gave them a place in church that hadn't necessarily existed before in America. So what I want from you, before we kind of move in, because this is just an introduction to this, is I want, for tonight, for you to create a Venn diagram between the First Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening. There are certain qualities that are unique to each of them, but then there are also similarities. So you can just do this on a separate sheet of paper, or my recommendation if you're going to do it online is to use something like Google Draw. You can do that. They don't have to be circles either, so you could just do this on a sheet of paper and create 3 columns. That's fine with me as well, so long as it's really clear that you label each one. Obviously in the video you can't click on these links, so I will provide them when you're on Schoology so that you can click on these 2 links, but you also have your notes, both the homework for this week, so chapter 11 in AMSCO, but you also have the notes from the First Great Awakening as well. So this is what I would like for you to do today, and then it gets turned in by tomorrow at 7:30 a.m. I will see you guys in class tomorrow.